In 1927, as the world still nursed the wounds of the First World War, Germany sought symbols of renewal, proof that its spirit and ingenuity could once again command respect on the world stage. From the shipyards of Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, a masterpiece emerged, the Cap Arcona, soon to be celebrated as the Queen of the South Atlantic. She was more than a vessel. She was a statement. Designed to rival the legendary Titanic, the Cap Arcona offered every luxury imaginable: gleaming brass railings, grand staircases, and a ballroom where music floated beneath crystal chandeliers. For a nation rebuilding its pride, the ship became a floating ambassador of elegance and engineering might. The Cap Arcona's maiden voyages were the stuff of travel brochures and whispered conversations among Europe's elite. Guests strolled her sun-drenched decks as the Atlantic breeze carried the promise of faraway lands. Fine dining salons overflowed with laughter and the clinking of crystal, while her smoking lounges welcomed writers, aristocrats, and adventurers who shared dreams of discovery. Every detail of the ship, from the carved wood paneling to the spotless service, proclaimed that Germany had returned to the forefront of world travel and culture. Yet beneath the polished brass and velvet curtains lay the unmistakable heartbeat of a changing era. The late 1920s were a time of both glittering optimism and quiet uncertainty. Around the globe, political tides shifted and economies teetered. Even as the Cap Arcona carried her passengers across the Atlantic with style and grace, the world she sailed through was poised on the edge of dramatic upheaval. This is not merely the story of a ship. It is the story of a century's hopes and heartbreaks, of human ambition and the unforeseen turns of history. From her glamorous beginnings to the dark chapters that would follow, the Cap Arcona's journey mirrors the triumphs and tragedies of an entire generation. Join us as we uncover the extraordinary life of this ill-fated ocean liner, its dazzling launch, its transformation during a time of turmoil, and the haunting legacy it left behind. If you love uncovering hidden histories and dramatic true stories, this is a tale you won't want to miss. Before we set sail into the remarkable saga of this Cap Arcona, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the notification bell. Your support helps us continue to bring you powerful stories from the past, stories that deserve to be remembered. Grab a seat, imagine the salt air on your face, and travel back with us to the year 1927, when the Queen of the South Atlantic first took to the seas and captured the world's imagination. The years that followed the Cap Arcona's glittering debut brought with them a restless tension, a subtle change in the air that even the ship's polished decks and sparkling chandeliers could not entirely disguise. Germany, still basking in the afterglow of its technological triumphs, was also a nation searching for direction, and in the political turmoil of the early 1930s a new force began to rise. The promise of national revival that had once been symbolized by grand achievements like the Cap Arcona was soon swept up in a darker, more calculated vision of power. When the National Socialist movement seized control, every emblem of German pride became a tool to project strength and legitimacy, and few symbols of modernity and prestige shone as brightly as the Queen of the South Atlantic herself. Joseph Goebbels, the new regime's master of propaganda, understood better than most the seductive power of spectacle. To him, the Cap Arcona was more than a ship. It was a stage, a floating theater upon which the grandeur of a reinvented Germany could be performed for the world to see. Her sweeping decks and majestic profile offered an image of elegance and progress that could be bent to the narrative of a nation reborn. Under Goebbels' careful direction, the ship became part of a carefully choreographed display designed to dazzle foreign eyes and reassure domestic audiences that Germany had not only recovered from the humiliation of defeat, but had also embraced a destiny of renewed greatness. It was during this period that the Cap Arcona's role shifted from luxury liner to cinematic backdrop, her once leisurely voyages giving way to the clamor of cameras and the carefully scripted illusions of film. The regime planned an ambitious production, an anti-British epic intended to stir patriotic fervor and undermine the image of Germany's souled rival. For weeks, the ship was transformed into a floating movie set. Crew members accustomed to tending to wealthy travelers now found themselves navigating cables and lighting rigs, their routines interrupted by the demands of directors and actors. The grand salons, once echoing with the laughter of international aristocracy, now became scenes of carefully staged confrontation meant to portray Britain as arrogant and untrustworthy. Goebbels spared no effort in ensuring that the film would impress. Costumes and props were chosen with meticulous attention to detail, and the camera lingered lovingly on the ship's elegant lines, turning her into a silent protagonist of German ambition. Yet beneath the controlled chaos of filmmaking, there was a quiet unease among those who had known the Cap Arcona in her days of unshadowed glory. The laughter of guests had been replaced by the barked orders of film crews and the whispered directives of party officials. The ship that had once embodied the simple joy of exploration was now conscripted into a narrative of division and suspicion. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the grand project failed to achieve the sweeping impact its creators had imagined. The film, despite its lavish production and the striking presence of the Cap Arcona, fell flat both at home and abroad. What was meant to be a triumph of cinematic persuasion instead revealed the limits of spectacle. The ship, intended to lend authenticity and glamour to a carefully crafted message, could not transform propaganda into truth. Audiences sensed the heavy hand of manipulation, and the film faded quickly into obscurity. For the Cap Arcona, however, the experience left a lingering mark. The vessel that had once been celebrated as a symbol of international elegance had now been drawn into the orbit of politics and power. Her name, once synonymous with luxury and the promise of adventure, now carried with it the subtle weight of association with a government whose ambitions reached far beyond the seas. Passengers who had once chosen her for the romance of ocean travel began to look elsewhere, weary of the growing shadows across Europe and the unsettling way that symbols of beauty and progress were being turned toward darker purposes. As the 1930s unfolded, the world moved steadily toward a storm that would engulf every nation. The Cap Arcona continued to sail, her engines still strong and her lines still graceful, but the mood aboard was no longer the same. The easy confidence of the late 20s had given way to whispered concerns and anxious glances toward a horizon darkened by political upheaval. For those who walked her decks, the ship was no longer simply a vessel of leisure. She had become a witness to the transformation of a society and an unwitting participant in the performance of a rising regime. In those years, the Cap Arcona's story ceased to be only about ocean crossings and elegant salons. It became entwined with the story of a nation that sought to cloak its ambitions in symbols of refinement, using beauty and spectacle to mask a gathering storm. The ship's grandeur remained, but its meaning had changed. What had once been a beacon of hope and pride now reflected the unsettling reality of a country where even the most innocent symbols of progress could be enlisted in the service of a far more troubling vision. The Cap Arcona still cut a magnificent figure on the horizon, her elegant silhouette gleaming as she sliced through the waves. But the world around her was shifting in ways that no polish or fresh coat of paint could disguise. After the fanfare of her earliest years and the brief, uneasy stint as a film set for a grand propaganda project, the mood aboard the ship grew more subdued. The same nations that had once been captivated by her charm now looked toward Germany with an unease that deepened with every headline. In drawing rooms from London to New York, whispers of the new government's harsh decrees and its growing hostility toward those it deemed outsiders began to overshadow the allure of a luxury voyage. The Cap Arcona, once celebrated as the Queen of the South Atlantic, found herself sailing through waters that felt colder not because of the sea, but because of the changing climate of international opinion. Guests who had once eagerly booked passage for the pleasure of her grand salons and starlit promenades began to cancel their journeys. Some cited vague concerns about the political climate. Others simply chose different destinations without explanation. The ship's crew, seasoned professionals who took pride in the traditions of ocean travel, noticed the difference almost immediately. Where once the passenger lists read like a roll call of international society industrialists, artists, statesmen, and celebrities, now they revealed conspicuous gaps. Invitations to dine at her tables or to waltz beneath her chandeliers no longer carried the same sparkle. The Cap Arcona's once lively evenings, filled with the music of orchestras and the murmur of cosmopolitan conversation, grew quieter as each season passed. The transformation of the ship's reputation mirrored the broader shift in how the world viewed Germany. The very government that had once trumpeted the Cap Arcona as a symbol of national renewal now pursued policies that alarmed and alienated those beyond its borders. Decrees restricting freedoms and singling out entire communities reached newspapers far from Berlin, and every new report added weight to the unease of potential passengers. For those who valued the Cap Arcona as a neutral space of elegance and adventure, the knowledge that she now sailed under the flag of an increasingly menacing state was impossible to ignore. Even those who had no direct quarrel with Germany's politics began to wonder whether a voyage aboard her decks would be seen as tacit approval of a government whose actions troubled the conscience of the world. The crew, many of whom had served since the ship's triumphant launch, felt the change as a slow tightening of atmosphere. They still polished brass railings and prepared fine meals, but the sense of pride that once accompanied their duties was tinged with unease. They could not help but overhear the conversations of the few remaining international travelers, quiet, sometimes tense discussions about the latest news from Berlin, the increasingly defiant speeches that filled the airwaves, the warnings from diplomats and newspapers that spoke of ambitions that reached far beyond Germany's borders. The Cap Arcona, once a floating testament to cultural exchange and peaceful travel, was now associated with a nation that many feared might plunge Europe into another conflict. As seasons passed and the political storm gathered strength, the ship's grand reputation dimmed. The very elegance that once drew admirers from around the world seemed now like an echo from another age, a reminder of an optimism that no longer felt possible. The great salons still glittered with crystal chandeliers. The decks still caught the golden glow of sunset over the Atlantic. Yet there was an unmistakable emptiness in the experience. The orchestra played to smaller audiences, and the few travelers who remained often chose quiet corners rather than the lively conversations that had once defined life aboard. The Cap Arcona was still beautiful, but her beauty had become a relic, something admired at a distance rather than embraced. In port cities that had once welcomed her with fanfare, the reception grew increasingly cool. The same newspapers that had celebrated her maiden voyage now carried editorials questioning the policies of the government under which she sailed. Dockside crowds thinned, and officials who had once sent formal greetings now offered only perfunctory acknowledgments. For a ship that had been conceived as a proud ambassador of a nation's return to grace, the change was striking and painful. The Cap Arcona remained a marvel of engineering and design, but her very identity as a symbol of national pride now worked against her in a world wary of the direction Germany had chosen. By the late 1930s, when tensions in Europe hardened into open threats and the world teetered on the edge of war, the Cap Arcona's decline in international stature was complete. She no longer drew the glittering guests who had once made her a legend of the seas. Instead, she sailed through increasingly uncertain waters, her reputation clouded by forces far beyond the control of her crew or her builders. What had begun as a story of rebirth and elegance now stood as a quiet testament to the way political ambition can tarnish even the most beautiful of creations. The ship that had once carried the hopes of a nation yearning for respect had become a silent witness to its growing isolation. Her grand decks and gleaming halls now a stage for the uneasy passage from an age of optimism into an era of looming conflict. When war finally consumed Europe, The Cap Arcona's elegant lines and proud history could no longer shield her from the reality of a continent in flames. The ship that had once embodied the spirit of carefree travel was drawn inexorably into the machinery of conflict. Gone were the days when her decks echoed with the music of orchestras and the chatter of travelers marveling at the endless sea. Now the same corridors that had once welcomed the world's elite were filled with the sounds of military orders and the heavy tread of boots. The German Navy, searching for every possible resource to fuel its war effort, turned its attention to the great liner and claimed her for its own. In those first days of requisition, the transformation was both swift and brutal. Velvet curtains were stripped away, polished woodwork dulled beneath the weight of rough handling, and the atmosphere of refined leisure that had once defined her identity vanished like mist before a storm. The Cap Arcona was initially assigned more routine naval duties, but as the war dragged on and the tide began to turn against Germany, her role grew darker and more desperate. The war that had begun with bold declarations and lightning advances had by the early 1940s become a grinding struggle that consumed everything in its path. Allied bombings and the tightening noose of encirclement strained every resource, and the German authorities sought to use whatever assets remained at their disposal. The great ship, once a symbol of national pride, was no longer a floating palace but a tool of a regime fighting for survival. Where once her grand salons had sparkled with crystal light, now they were stripped to bare walls and repurposed for tasks far removed from any vision of elegance. As the final months of conflict approached and the Allies pressed relentlessly toward Germany's heartland, the atmosphere aboard grew increasingly grim. Orders came from high command that would seal the Cap Arcona's fate and turn her story from one of tarnished glamour to one of unimaginable suffering. Concentration camp prisoners, forced on death marches and hurried evacuations as the Nazi leadership sought to hide evidence of its crimes, were herded toward the ports of northern Germany. Lübeck Bay became a gathering point for those the regime wished to keep from falling into Allied hands. In this frantic, chaotic endgame, the Cap Arcona, once the pride of peacetime luxury, was chosen as a holding vessel, a temporary and desperate cage for thousands of men and women who had already endured years of brutality. For those brought aboard, the ship's past grandeur was a bitter echo of a world they scarcely remembered. They were crammed into spaces never meant to hold such numbers, into cabins and holds stripped of comfort and light. The wide promenade decks where wealthy travelers had once strolled beneath starlit skies were now places of confinement. The railings that once framed views of endless horizons, now marking the limits of a grim captivity. Hunger and exhaustion shadowed every movement. Guards barked orders and kept watch, their presence turning the ship's once welcoming passages into a labyrinth of fear. The Cap Arcona, with her proud name and graceful lines, had become a floating prison. Outside, the Baltic winds carried the sound of distant artillery as Allied forces closed in. The leadership in Berlin, desperate to obscure the scale of their crimes, issued commands that scattered prisoners across ships and remote camps, hoping to hide them from advancing armies and to prevent them from bearing witness. The Cap Arcona, once admired for her power and speed, was now an unwilling participant in this final act of concealment. Her hull, built to weather storms and cross oceans, now held thousands whose lives hung by a thread, their fate determined not by the sea but by the chaos of a regime collapsing upon itself. The crew that remained, some long accustomed to life at sea, found themselves confronting a reality far removed from anything they had known in the ship's golden age. The proud rituals of maritime tradition were gone, replaced by the harsh necessities of a wartime prison. They watched as the decks filled with gaunt faces and wary eyes, and the Cap Arcona's once bright spirit seemed to sink beneath the weight of human misery. The ocean, indifferent and vast, lapped against the hull with the same rhythm it always had. But within the ship there was only the heavy silence of those who had survived too much and the restless anticipation of those who feared the next command. By the spring of 1945, with Allied forces drawing ever closer and Germany's defeat inevitable, the Cap Arcona bore little resemblance to the proud ocean liner that had once carried the hopes of a nation yearning for renewal. She was no longer a symbol of progress or luxury, but a vessel of desperation, a final refuge for those whom the regime sought to hide and, perhaps, to silence. Her elegant silhouette still graced the waters of Lübeck Bay, but to those who knew her story, she had become a haunting emblem of a world turned upside down. The ship that had once promised adventure and wonder now stood as a silent witness to human suffering and the catastrophic consequences of ambition gone terribly astray. By the last desperate weeks of April 1945, the once proud Cap Arcona lay at anchor in the grey waters of Lübeck Bay. Her elegant silhouette still recognizable, but her spirit long since broken. The war that had transformed her from a celebrated ocean liner into a tool of military necessity was now itself collapsing, and the regime that had claimed her for its purposes was unraveling in chaos and fear. Allied forces were advancing from every direction, their artillery rumbling ever closer. And in Berlin the final acts of a brutal era were being written. Orders flowed from the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. Commands marked by a grim determination to erase evidence of the crimes committed in years of persecution. Heinrich Himmler, one of the architects of the regime's terror, demanded that the vast network of camps and prisons be liquidated, a cold word for an unspeakable aim, to prevent survivors from testifying to what they had endured. In this fevered atmosphere of collapse, the Cap Arcona, already scarred by her wartime transformation into a floating prison, was summoned to play one last role in a drama of human desperation. From across northern Germany, columns of prisoners were driven toward the coast. These were men and women who had survived years of hardship, only to face new ordeals in the war's dying days. Their faces were gaunt, their steps unsteady, and many stumbled under the weight of exhaustion and hunger. They came from camps emptied in frantic haste, herded along muddy roads under the watchful eyes of armed guards, uncertain whether they were marching toward freedom or toward death. The roar of distant bombardment followed them like an ominous drumbeat, and the chill of the Baltic spring cut through their thin clothing. Some barely spoke, conserving what little strength remained. Others whispered to one another in languages from across Europe, sharing fragments of hope that the approaching Allies might bring rescue before it was too late. At the docks of Lübeck Bay the Cap Arcona waited, her once gleaming hull now weathered and streaked with rust. Where once bands had played and passengers had boarded with excited chatter, now the air was thick with the sounds of shouted orders and the shuffle of wary feet. Prisoners were driven up gangways and forced aboard in staggering numbers, packed into the ship's interior with no regard for comfort or even survival. Cabins that had once hosted elegant travelers were now crowded beyond imagining, and the grand salons that had echoed with music and laughter became holding pens for the starving and the sick. The scent of salt water mixed with the acrid smell of fear and unwashed bodies, a reminder of how far the Cap Arcona had fallen from the glory of her early days. For the ship's crew and the few naval personnel overseeing the operation, the transformation was as jarring as it was grim. Some of these men had served in peacetime, when the Cap Arcona represented the best of German craftsmanship and hospitality. Now they watched as thousands of prisoners, Poles, Russians, French, Dutch, and countless others were pressed into every available space. The groans of the ill and the quiet weeping of those too tired to cry out echoed through corridors that had once been polished and bright. Guards patrolled the decks with rifles slung across their shoulders, their voices sharp and impatient, while the prisoners huddled together in silent endurance. The ship that had once carried the elite of Europe across the Atlantic now carried only the weight of human suffering and the cold resolve of a regime determined to hide its deeds. Outside the harbor, the war drew to its violent close. The Allies were near, their presence felt in the distant thud of artillery and the steady advance of troops across northern Germany. Yet for those aboard the Cap Arcona there was no clarity, no certainty that liberation was at hand. Rumors passed among the prisoners, some spoke of rescue. Others feared a more sinister plan. They knew only that they had been torn from the camps in haste and forced onto ships without explanation. The sea that stretched beyond the bay offered no comfort, only the chill of an unknown fate. The Baltic's cold waters, calm and deceptively peaceful, mirrored the quiet dread that settled over the ship. Night after night the prisoners endured the suffocating conditions below deck. Hunger gnawed at their strength, thirst parched their throats, and the constant fear of what might come next weighed on every heart. For some, the memory of the Cap Arcona's former splendor was known only through whispers from those who remembered her days of grandeur. It was almost impossible to believe that the same vessel that once hosted gala dinners and elegant voyages now stood as a floating cage at the edge of a war-torn continent. The contrast was almost too cruel to comprehend. A ship once built to symbolize national renewal had become the final stop in a journey marked by unimaginable hardship. Above them, the sky over Lübeck Bay shifted from the pale light of spring mornings to the dim glow of uncertain evenings, each day bringing the sound of approaching battles and the promise of an end to the conflict. Yet for those trapped aboard, time moved with agonizing slowness. Each creak of the hull, each shouted order from the guards, seemed to carry the weight of finality. The Cap Arcona, her name once spoken with pride, now floated like a silent witness to the desperation of a dying regime and the indomitable endurance of those who refused to surrender their humanity even in the face of unthinkable suffering. In the gathering twilight of the third reach, the Grand Luna waited in grim stillness, her fate and the fate of those packed within her steel walls hanging in the balance as the war's last terrible chapter prepared to unfold. The morning of May 3rd, 1945, arrived shrouded in a bleak mist that clung to the waters of Lübeck Bay, as if the sea itself sensed the calamity about to unfold. The Cap Arcona, once the glittering queen of the South Atlantic, now floated like a silent, doomed relic of another time, her grand ballrooms and glittering chandeliers long since replaced by the cries and coughs of thousands of starving prisoners crammed into her dark, airless holds. From the deck the horizon stretched in a flat, cold line, the only movement the occasional shiver of a bitter spring wind and the uneasy lapping of waves against the rusting hull. To the prisoners below, the sound of the water had become an ominous reminder of how far from safety they were, and how little hope remained as the war staggered toward its violent end. Above the bay, the droning of engines began as a low hum, so faint that at first it could be mistaken for the restless wind. Yet within minutes it grew into a menacing roar that set the steel plates of the ship trembling. Prisoners and guards alike looked skyward as the dark shapes of RAF Typhoon bombers emerged from the grey clouds like hawks swooping for prey. To the pilots, their mission was straightforward: intercept and destroy what intelligence reports had described as vessels carrying fleeing officers, high-ranking Nazis desperate to escape the tightening Allied net. The Cap Arcona, along with other ships moored nearby, appeared to be an ideal target, large, imposing silhouettes against the pale water, ripe for the decisive strike that would prevent any final German escape. The first rockets screamed down through the mist with a shriek that split the morning calm. A thunderous explosion tore through the ship's side, sending metal fragments spinning into the air and throwing men off their feet. The once proud Luna lurched violently, her great frame groaning as if in protest at the assault. Flames erupted along the decks, racing with terrifying speed as oil and fuel ignited in bursts of searing heat. Prisoners in the lower holds, many too weak to stand, were jolted awake by the deafening blasts and the sudden rush of smoke and choking fumes. Panic spread faster than the fire itself. The narrow passageways, already stifling, filled with a crush of desperate bodies as men and women clawed toward any glimmer of light, any hint of escape. Above them the attack continued in relentless waves, Rockets struck the Cap Arcona's flanks, tearing open gaping wounds in her hull. Each impact sent a shudder through the decks and a rain of sparks and molten metal onto those below. The prisoners who reached the open air were met not by salvation but by a chaos of flame and shrapnel. Black smoke billowed skyward, blotting out the sun, while the acrid stench of burning oil and scorched wood mingled with the cries of those already lost to the inferno. Some leapt into the frigid Baltic waters, their gaunt bodies hitting the sea with a dull splash, only to be pulled under by the weight of exhaustion or the icy grip of the current. From the cockpits of the Typhoons, the scene below must have looked like a strategic victory. The enemy's escape thwarted, the ships crippled and burning. The pilots could not have known that beneath the decks lay not fleeing as officers, but thousands of innocent captive people who had already endured the unspeakable horrors of concentration camps, and now faced death in one final, brutal twist of fate. The miscalculation would go down as one of the most tragic mistakes of the war. A cruel irony in the closing hours of a conflict that had already consumed millions of lives. As the Cap Arcona burned, her once opulent silhouette now a skeleton of flame and smoke, the surrounding bay became a graveyard. Survivors who managed to cling to debris watched in numb disbelief as the ship listed heavily, the water swallowing her grandeur piece by piece. The cold was merciless, leeching the last reserves of strength from those who struggled to keep their heads above the waves. Some drifted silently, eyes fixed on the darkened sky, while others whispered prayers or simply stared, too wary for words. The air was thick with the crackle of fire and the distant thunder of departing bombers, their engines fading into the horizon as if the sky itself was turning its back on the tragedy below. By the time the smoke began to thin and the echoes of rockets had died, the Cap Arcona lay a smouldering wreck, her decks awash with the wreckage of human lives. The grandeur that once made her a floating palace of German pride was gone, replaced by the silence of an ocean that had claimed yet another chapter of wartime sorrow. The attack, born of mistaken intelligence and carried out in the chaos of war's final days, left behind one of the darkest maritime disasters of the 20th century. It was a bitter epitaph for a ship that had once embodied the hopes of a nation, a floating dream turned into a fiery tome, and for the countless souls who perished in those icy waters, a cruel ending to a nightmare that should have ended with liberation. The great liner that once been a jewel of German pride now writhed in her death throes, a floating inferno torn open by rockets and riddled with holes that let the icy Baltic rush in with a merciless hiss. The frigid water surged through shattered corridors and grand salons where crystal chandeliers had once glittered in the glow of evening dances, now darkened and drowned beneath waves that swallowed furniture, splintered beams, and human cries alike. Smoke and flame fought with the freezing tide for dominion over the ship, and the Cap Arcona groaned as if the steel itself felt the weight of so much suffering. In this, prisoners already weak from months of starvation and disease found themselves trapped between two mortal enemies. The fire that devoured the decks above and the black, numbing water that climbed relentlessly from below. Those who could stand pushed toward hatches and gangways, clawing their way through choking smoke as the ship listed heavily, every lurch threatening to hurl them into the rising flood. The smell of burning oil stung their throats and eyes, but there was no time to hesitate. Some tried to scale the rails, their trembling hands slick with soot and salt, while others clung to fragments of shattered lifeboats. The few lifeboats still intact swung crazily, ropes frayed or already lost to the flames. In every corner of the ship, desperation drowned out fear. Men and women who had survived years of brutality now threw themselves toward any chance of escape, their only hope the freezing waters beyond the wreck. One by one they leaped, their thin bodies breaking the surface of the Baltic with a dull, final sound. The shock of the water was a different kind of torment, an Arctic grip that seized their lungs and stiffened their limbs in seconds. Some tried to swim, their strokes slow and labored, while others simply sank beneath the weight of exhaustion and despair. The cries that rose over the bay were a chorus of anguish, muffled by smoke and the steady roar of the ship's collapsing superstructure. For those who managed to cling to wreckage or float toward the distant shoreline, survival remained far from certain. The beaches of Lübeck Bay offered no sanctuary. Along the cold sand and shallow surf, armed guards waited men who only days before had overseen the prisoners' transport to these death ships and now carried out their final orders with pitiless efficiency. Survivors staggered from the water, shivering and gasping, only to meet the hard glint of rifles. Shots rang out against the crackle of burning timbers and the hiss of steam from the dying liner. Figures who had endured the camps, who had cheated death in the fire and the sea, collapsed beneath the final cruelty of bullets, their brief hope extinguished before it could take root. All around the bay the water itself became a grave. Bodies drifted among floating planks and oil slicks, the tide rocking them gently as if the sea sought to soothe what man had wrought. The Cap Arcona, her elegant silhouette now a blackened skeleton, slowly surrendered to the depths, carrying with her the memories of countless lives, each a story of survival cut short in the war's last, most senseless hours. The smoke that curled upward into the overcast sky carried not only the scent of burning steel but the unspoken testimony of thousands who would never see freedom. When the flames finally died and the smoke lifted, the scale of the catastrophe revealed itself with a silence more haunting than any explosion. Rough estimates counted about 7,000 dead, a toll so immense it eclipsed nearly every other maritime disaster in history, rivaling even the most infamous shipwrecks of peacetime and war alike. This was not the romantic tragedy of a luxury liner lost to an iceberg, nor the sudden violence of a naval battle. It was a massacre born of misinformation and cruelty, an avoidable calamity inflicted upon those who had already endured the worst of human brutality. For the few who survived, those pulled half-frozen from the water, or who managed to slip past the last gunfire, the memory of the day became a wound that never healed. They carried with them the sight of the once grand Cap Arcona. Her decks, where the wealthy had once strolled, now charred and shattered. Her name forever severed from the promise of safe passage and transformed instead into a symbol of betrayal and unimaginable loss. Historians would later debate the decisions that led to the attack. The fog of war that obscured the truth from the pilots who believed they were striking a fleeing enemy. Yet for those who perished, and for those who lived to remember, no explanation could soften the cruel irony of dying on the very eve of liberation. As the tides of Lübeck Bay returned to their quiet rhythm, the wreck of the Cap Arcona settled beneath the waves, a ghostly monument to the countless lives claimed in those final chaotic days of the Second World War. Her story endures not only as a cautionary tale of war's tragic misunderstandings, but as a solemn reminder of the human cost hidden behind the grand narratives of history, a cost measured not in strategies or battles, but in the silent, uncountable voices lost to smoke, fire, and the cold embrace of the sea. In the uneasy calm that followed the war, when Europe struggled to rebuild its cities and its spirit, the story of the Cap Arcona seemed to fade into a shadowed corner of collective memory. Families grieved in private, survivors spoke in hushed tones, and official records, those that might have explained or at least acknowledged the magnitude of the loss, remained stubbornly out of reach. The British government, responsible for the air command that had ordered the strike, chose a policy of silence. In a world desperate to move forward, the wreck of a single ship, even one carrying thousands of innocent lives, was treated as a painful subject best left unexplored. For years the incident was little more than a whispered rumor, its details pieced together from the recollections of the few who had survived the inferno and the freezing Baltic waters. Local fishermen who had pulled bodies from the tide carried the images in their minds long after the rest of the world turned away. Survivors who managed to rebuild their lives spoke of the nightmarish hours when the great liner became a trap of fire and ice. Yet even they sensed that their testimony alone could not force the truth into the open. Every attempt to learn more, every request for official confirmation, every petition for a formal inquiry met the same answer. The relevant documents were classified. Behind the locked doors of government archives lay the full account of the Royal Air Force mission, the intelligence briefings, and the communication records that might have explained why the Typhoon pilots mistook the Cap Arcona for an enemy escape vessel. Officially, the war had ended. The victors had no desire to revisit decisions made in the fog of conflict. Britain, still healing from years of bombardment and rationing, had become a symbol of wartime endurance and moral clarity. To admit that its own pilots might have unwittingly caused one of the war's greatest civilian maritime disasters risked not only diplomatic embarrassment, but also the unraveling of the carefully woven narrative of a just and heroic struggle. So the silence deepened. As the 1950s passed into the 1960s, the world's attention shifted to new crises and new wars, and the Cap Arcona remained a footnote, mentioned only occasionally in local histories or in the recollections of aging veterans. Some suspected that the truth would never be revealed. Survivors who had seen friends perish in the cold waters of Lübeck Bay wondered if the world had simply decided to forget them. Children of the dead grew up with fragments of stories and the lingering ache of unanswered questions. The bay itself kept its secrets well. The wreck, salvaged by the Soviets, had vanished, and with it the physical evidence that might have spoken more eloquently than any report. But history has a way of breaking even the most carefully built walls of secrecy. In the early 1970s, when a new generation of historians began pressing for transparency and the public mood shifted toward confronting the ambiguities of the war, long classified files finally emerged from the shadows. Yellowed pages, stamped confidential in fading ink, were unsealed, and the tragedy of the Cap Arcona stepped back into the light. These documents revealed the miscommunication, the intelligence failures, and the tragic assumptions that had led to the RAF's fateful attack. They did not diminish the bravery of the pilots, nor did they erase the wartime context of confusion and fear, but they made clear that the catastrophe had not been an unavoidable act of fate. It was a human error terrible in its consequences and compounded by decades of official silence. For those who had waited so long, the release of these records brought a measure of vindication, though hardly comfort. Survivors who were now elderly read the reports with a bittersweet recognition, finding at last the evidence that confirmed what they had known in their hearts, that the thousands who died on that cold May day were victims not of deliberate cruelty from the skies, but of a fatal misunderstanding. Families of the lost could finally speak their loved ones' names in public ceremonies and memorials, no longer burdened by the sense that their grief was unacknowledged. The revelation also forced a reckoning with the larger story of the war. It reminded the world that even the righteous can make mistakes, that the fog of conflict clouds the vision of those who believe they fight for justice. The Cap Arcona's fate became more than a tragic footnote. It became a warning about the dangers of secrecy and the moral responsibility of nations to confront their own errors. In classrooms and history books, the ship that had once carried the dreams of a nation, and then the despair of its prisoners, now carried another lesson: that the truth, no matter how long suppressed, will eventually surface, and that only by facing it can we hope to honor the lives that were lost. By the time the documents were finally made public, the Cap Arcona herself had been gone for more than 2 decades, her wreck salvaged and scattered. Yet the story they told gave her a different kind of presence, not in steel and rivets, but in the conscience of those who studied the war's complex legacy. The silence had been broken, and with it the last barrier to understanding one of the most haunting maritime tragedies of the 20th century. In the end, the unsealing of those dusty files was not merely an administrative act. It was an act of remembrance, a belated recognition that the dead of Lübeck Bay deserved more than secrecy, they deserved truth, and through truth, a measure of peace. For a few short years after the smoke cleared and the war gave way to uneasy peace, the Cap Arcona remained where she had fallen, her blackened hull resting like a ghost upon the cold floor of Lübeck Bay. Fishermen and sailors passing over those waters would sometimes speak of strange shapes rising just beneath the waves, of a silent outline visible in the early morning light when the sea lay still as glass. The once proud liner that had carried the dreams of a nation and then the despair of thousands seemed to linger between worlds, neither fully gone nor truly alive, a steel phantom holding her secrets in the dark currents below. The Baltic tides washed over her twisted decks and empty cabins, carrying away the last traces of smoke and oil. But the memory of that terrible day clung to the wreck as though the sea itself refused to forget. Local villagers who remembered the thunder of the air raid and the acrid smell of burning paint at times pointed from the shore toward the place where she lay. They said the water changed color there, as if it bore a bruise. For survivors and families of the dead, the hidden wreck became both a wound and a shrine. No monument marked the spot. No official plaque honored the thousands lost. Yet the presence of the ship was felt in every gust of briny wind. Fishermen spoke of nets snagged on unseen metal, of sudden tugs from below, and though few admitted it aloud, many believed the Cap Arcona herself was calling for remembrance. Through the late 1940s, as Europe rebuilt and new borders hardened, the wreck became a quiet bargaining chip in the uneasy politics of the post-war world. The bay lay in the Soviet occupation zone, and it was the Soviet authorities who decided the ship's ultimate fate. In 1949, just 4 years after the disaster, Soviet salvage crews arrived with heavy equipment and a cold efficiency. There was no ceremony, no gathering of mourners. The men worked under grey skis, stripping the once magnificent liner of the steel and iron that could be reused in the urgent reconstruction of a continent. Great cranes groaned as they pulled free the skeletal remains of her decks. Sections of the hull that had once gleamed with white paint and gold trim were cut apart and lifted dripping from the water, each piece a silent witness to the thousands who had perished within. Observers on the shore watched the operation with a mixture of fascination and unease. Some had lived with the wreck for years, had drawn a strange comfort from its invisible presence. To see it dismantled, to hear the echo of metal breaking after so much human suffering, felt like a second death. Survivors of the tragedy, scattered across Europe, heard of the salvage in brief newspaper reports. For them the news was bitterly symbolic. The last physical trace of the disaster was being erased not by time or tide but by human hands. The Cap Arcona, once a floating palace and later a tomb, would leave behind no bones, no grave marker on the sea to bear witness. By the time the last scrap of metal had been lifted and carted away, Lübeck Bay looked once more like any other stretch of the Baltic grey. Windswept and deceptively calm, ships passed overhead without pause, and children played on the beaches unaware that beneath those waters had once rested the shattered remains of a vessel whose story rivaled the most infamous tragedies of the sea. The silence returned, broken only by the calls of seabirds and the endless rhythm of the waves. Yet for those who knew, that silence carried a different weight. It was the silence of a place where memory had been submerged, where history had been physically removed yet remained stubbornly present in the hearts of those who remembered. Decades later, when the long-hidden government documents were finally unsealed and the world learned the full story of the disaster, the absence of the wreck itself added a haunting dimension to the revelation. There was nothing left to visit, no rusting hull to touch, no corroded rails to remind future generations of what had transpired. The Cap Arcona existed only in photographs, in fragments of testimony, and in the grief of families who had never been able to bury their dead. The sea had given up its steel, but not its dead, and not the memory of the thousands who had perished in fire and ice. Today, when historians recount the tragedy, they often speak of the Cap Arcona as a ghost ship. Not merely because she lies unseen beneath the waves, she does not, but because her story floats in the space between remembrance and loss. No museum displays her timbers. No harbor preserves her silhouette. The Baltic has long since swallowed the last trace of her physical form. Yet her name carries the weight of all that happened on that fateful day in May 1945. She lives on in records and in the careful words of those who tell her story. A reminder that even when the evidence is gone, history endures. The Cap Arcona's disappearance beneath the grasp of Soviet salvage crews was not the end of her tale, but another chapter in a narrative that warns how easily the material signs of human tragedy can vanish, leaving only the duty of memory to keep the truth alive. In the end, the story of the Cap Arcona stands as far more than the chronicle of a single ship's destruction. It is a mirror held up to the darkest side of human conflict, where a vessel once celebrated as a floating palace became the stage for a final act of cruelty and confusion. Built to dazzle the world with elegance and grace, the ship's very name once stirred images of moonlit crossings and the promise of adventure on the open sea. Yet in the waning days of the Second World War, those same decks that had once echoed with the laughter of high society became a place of terror and despair. The Cap Arcona's journey from a symbol of national pride to a floating coffin reflects the way war twists and disfigures all it touches, turning even symbols of joy into instruments of tragedy. The horror that unfolded in Lübeck Bay was not the result of a single villain or a simple act of malice. It was the consequence of a chain of choices made in a world already torn by chaos, a fog of war thick enough to obscure even the most obvious truths. The Nazi leadership, desperate to erase the evidence of their crimes, set the tragedy in motion by herding thousands of weakened prisoners aboard ships that had once represented the glamour of German engineering. The Allied pilots, acting on flawed intelligence and under unimaginable pressure to bring the conflict to its conclusion, struck those ships with the force of righteous fury, never realizing that their targets carried innocents instead of enemy combatants. And in the aftermath, the long silence imposed by political caution only deepened the wound, leaving survivors and families to grieve in a silence that lasted for decades. This is why the story endures. The Cap Arcona reminds us that the brutality of war is rarely confined to the battlefield, and that the suffering it causes often extends far beyond the calculations of generals or the lines drawn on a map. It teaches us that propaganda can glamorize violence, that chaos can overwhelm reason, and that miscommunication can magnify tragedy until its consequences become almost unbearable. The ship's fate challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, that even in the pursuit of justice, even among those who believe themselves to be on the side of righteousness, mistakes can bring about untold suffering. Yet out of this darkness comes a duty that belongs to all of us, the duty to remember. The Cap Arcona no longer exists. The Soviets salvaged her remains, and the Baltic waters carry no physical trace of the ship that once commanded the world's attention. But memory is not bound by steel or timber. It lives in the voices of survivors, in the painstaking research of historians, and in the hearts of all who refuse to let these lives be forgotten. By telling this story, we honor those who perished and remind ourselves of the human cost that hides behind the grand narratives of war and victory. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening to the story of a ship whose life and death continue to speak across the decades. If you found this journey meaningful, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so that together we can keep history's lessons alive. Your support helps ensure that stories like this, stories of courage, of tragedy, and of the resilience of memory, will continue to reach new generations. As a close, may the memory of those lost on the Cap Arcona remind us of our shared responsibility to seek truth, to cherish peace, and to guard against the blindness that war can bring. Thank you once again for being here. Sleep well, and may the lessons of the past light your way into a more peaceful tomorrow.